Black voters on the rise. We have come together again in an effort to ensure that all eligible voters are able to cast their ballots free from fear, intimidation. We are doing so by way of an election protection and poll monitoring program across 8 states in the South, including Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas. During this time, you will hear brief reports on what's occurring on the ground in these states, as well as hearing how poor and low-income voters are the swing vote in this country. As a point of housekeeping, we ask that all press utilize the Q&A function to submit your questions, which we will allot some time for at the end of this briefing. I would now like to introduce our co-chairs, the national co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival, Bishop William J. Barber II, who also serves as president and senior lecturer of Repairs of the Breach, and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, who also serves as the executive director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. Bishop Barber. Bishop, can you hear us? We see you on the screen, but I do not hear audio coming through.
Yeah, he should be. Bishop? Might have got disconnected when he was there.
No problem.
Let me try him again.
Thank you so much. And while we're getting Bishop Barber on the line, I would like to start us off with Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kaz. It's a great honor to be with everyone today on this historic election day. If we ever needed to vote, it is now. And it's powerful to be here with the Legal Defense Fund and Forward Justice. And on behalf of the coordinating committees in states all across the country, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is honored to be doing this election protection work, as well as this reminder to get out to vote. It's important that we are here to talk about the connection between economic justice and voting rights, because they're so deeply connected. This rich nation has the wherewithal to end poverty tomorrow, so we can't overlook the voices and votes of poor and low-income people, and we need to protect them. We know that poor and low-income voters make up a third of the voting electorate across the country, and in many places, especially in the South, even more. Many of the states that have election protection work happening today, Alabama, close to half of the voters are poor and low income, 42% in Mississippi, 36% in Louisiana. And we're doing this poll monitoring and election protection work because we know that voter suppression and intimidation denies the rights of potentially millions of Americans and our ability to make the decisions that impact our lives. And it impacts poor and low-income people the most, both in whose votes are most often being suppressed and in what happens when extremists get into office and pass policies that hurt poor and vulnerable people the most. But we know in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, that poor and low-income people have the power with our votes to make all the difference. And so that's why we have reached out to millions of low-income infrequent voters who are turning up and turning out in this election. They're voting and saying to us that our communities are directly impacted by policies imposed by systems put in place as a result of the vote. They're voting because they see voting as a tool, a right, and a responsibility, and how we hold decision makers accountable. They're voting because we're standing up for the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, live with dignity. And people are voting because they're going to be proud that we've put in this time knocking on doors and spreading on social media one-on-one conversations to hear another out, because we won't be silent anymore. So it's amazing to be here, and to be able to do this briefing today. We know that we are indeed the swing vote that can make the difference and are making the difference in this election.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Theo-Harris. Bishop Barber, we have you on the line. Yes, Bishop Barber, we have you on the line.
Can you hear me?
Can people on this call hear Bishop?
Yes.
Great. Yes, they can hear you, Bishop. Yes.
Great. I'm sorry that for some reason, those members of the media, we're having technical difficulty. And I did want to come on briefly. Primarily, this call is more for those persons who work, lawyers and the protectors of the vote. So we want to hear from them in this briefing today. But we've been working for this entire year.
Bishop, are you there? I believe we lost Bishop Barber, but if he calls again, we'll make sure to put him through here on the line. I would now like to introduce the President and Director of Counsel for the Legal Defense Funds, Janine Nelson. Thank you so much for being here, Janine.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and an honor. Happy Election Day to everyone. And this is such an important moment for our democracy. So thank you for the opportunity to have this briefing and conversation. I also want to thank Bishop Barber and Reverend Dr. Theo Harris and all of our friends at Forward Justice and the Poor People's Campaign for being such excellent partners in the unending work to ensure that there is full participation in our democracy, particularly among Black communities and other communities of color and other historically marginalized groups. As Dr. Brown said, my name is Janine Nelson. I'm the President and Director Counsel of Legal Defense Fund. More than 78 million people have cast a ballot during the early voting period. And today, millions more either already have or will at some point today or tonight cast their ballots. And our votes are our voices. And people across the country are making their voices heard this election cycle up and down the ballot. At every step of the election process, LDF and our partners, including Forward Justice and the Poor People's Campaign, have been deeply engaged across the South, empowering Black voters who will help determine the future of our multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And we're in the South for an important reason. More than half of the Black population in the United States lives in the South. And those states, as we know, have historically erected the steepest barriers to the ballot. Many of those states were covered by the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, and no longer have that protection. So to support those efforts, we have similarly empowered thousands of nonpartisan election protection volunteers across the South who are on the ground today. They've been on the ground since early voting. They were on the ground even during the primaries, and they are monitoring our poll sites to make sure that voters can fully access the polls. They're sharing pertinent information about polling location changes and other issues that come up for voters on election day. They're communicating with members of the community about the election and voting processes and addressing day of issues as they arise in the moment. They're using our 1-866 Our Vote hotline, and they are there in person to provide real-time support. So let me pivot to what we've seen so far. Based on reports from our volunteers, this year, it has been incredibly important to have nonpartisan volunteers and lawyers on the ground to help voters navigate the election. We know that there are new laws that are in place that were not in place in 2020. There are more threats in this moment than we have experienced in recent past. And so the importance of nonpartisan volunteers cannot be overstated. Some of what we've seen so far has been deeply alarming. We've seen polling locations moved. We've seen polling sites open late and even closed, leaving voters in a lurch. We saw that quite specifically in connection with some municipal elections and voters not understanding what they needed to do after a superintendent decided to quit the day before the election. Voters have had to stand in long lines, sometimes in unsafe locations, especially in places where there are no early voting periods. And there's a lack of investment and very limited election infrastructure in many places. And that leads to administrative issues like voting machine malfunctions, incorrect ballots, limited supplies, something as simple as ensuring that voters have black pens available to fill out their ballots isn't as easy as one would think in this all-important election. There are places where voters with disabilities and seniors have had limited access to parking or no access to ramps. We've seen poor signage in many places, so voters have to look for their polling place and don't know exactly where to go. We have been doing on-the-ground advocacy throughout the day to ensure that voters are not being disenfranchised as a result of these varied issues. And there has also been a series of non-credible threats that have briefly disrupted voting in Georgia and Florida. I just received a moment ago a bulletin that voting in Fulton County has been extended. We finally got the firm order because of these disruptions. And it's important that we push and try to litigate to make sure that no one is disenfranchised and that everyone has their allotted time to be able to vote, even if the polls have to be extended in order to accommodate that. So the sad reality is you're going to hear a lot about incidents throughout the day. Some of it may be very scary. That's where we are at this point. The goal is to intimidate you. The goal is to scare people out of voting, especially marginalized groups. But make no mistake, the biggest threat we're all facing is the threat to democracy. So it's important that voters understand this message. We cannot give up. We cannot give up our vote. We cannot give up our voice. We cannot be deterred. We must stay in line. We must cast our ballots, and we must ensure that they are counted. And LDF will be on the ground after the election to make sure that tabulation is happening appropriately and that the vote count is not interfered with or interrupted in any way. And if you have issues on election day, do not hesitate to call the Voter Protection Helpline at 866-OUR-VOTE. That's 1-866-OUR-VOTE. LDF and our partners will continue to monitor what's happening on the ground. We'll communicate with voters, and we will be taking any steps necessary to ensure that voters have full access to the ballot. I also want to reiterate that this is a nonpartisan effort, and our poll monitors are there to help. When voters see nonpartisan election protection poll monitors, they're typically identified by clothing or badges that declare their nonpartisan volunteer status. And people can rest assured that these individuals are there to serve the general public and to help them navigate the voting process. They are not pushing an agenda. They are not keeping for any party or politician. They are there to serve our democracy. So I'll close with this. As defenders of justice and access to the ballot, we are fully equipped to handle whatever today and tonight bring. We have the tools we need, no matter what, to ensure that our voices are never silenced. People who believe in this multiracial democracy where everyone's voice is heard are the majority of this country. We are the future of this country, and nothing will stand in the way of our work to ensure that our rights are protected, upheld, and expanded. So thank you very much for participating this year and every year.
Thank you so much, Attorney Nelson. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We will now hear from co-founder of Forward Justice, Attorney Caitlyn Swain.
I am so glad to be here with you all today. There's nowhere that we would rather be except for out at a polling place in this moment. I'm Caitlyn Swain, co-director of Forward Justice, Law Policy and Strategy Center, dedicated to advancing social, racial, and economic justice in the South. And we are so proud to be working with the Poor People's Campaign and the NAACP LDF in this cycle. There is a feeling here in North Carolina that I want to bring to this call today. And it is exactly what Director Counsel Nelson just said, which is that we are not backing down. We are going to see this election through. Collectively, the states our teams have been monitoring today control 134 electoral votes in this country, and they are home to over 26.7 million poor and low-wage eligible infrequent voters. As we continue to face sobering attacks on our democracy, the criminalization of poverty, and the impact of deep racial and environmental injustice, our sacred right to vote must be fiercely protected. We know this. Bishop Barber and Reverend Theo Harris remind us consistently the voices of the millions of Americans most impacted by policy and racial violence cannot be silenced in this cycle or in this country. I want to speak to where we sit in this nation right now. 11 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. The people are united across this nation, sending a clear message that we are not going to allow the onslaught of voter suppression tactics to silence us. We are here to protect voters in each of these states so that they can cast ballots free from fear, intimidation, and coercion, and we will not back down. Here in the state of North Carolina, where I'm speaking from today, alongside the Poor People's Campaign, the NAACP, LDF, and incredible voting rights partners across the state, we have addressed more than 4,000 voting complaints since early voting began through the Nonpartisan Election Protection Hotline. More than 250 complaints have involved voter intimidation. We are not afraid to tell the truth that there is hostility in this cycle. There is a climate of cynical intimidation tactics that are occurring, but our people are standing up and fighting back. We are resolving these issues because we know that we will not leave any power on the table in this cycle. I also want to note that in North Carolina, this is the first presidential election where a discriminatory photo voter ID requirement is in place in this state. We have received more than 400 questions and complaints about that requirement, and we have been fielding that throughout the early voting period and on election day. We want to make it clear to all North Carolina voters, because we know that this is a razor-thin election, and people are turning out at incredible numbers across the state. You have the right to vote with or without a photo voter ID today. You can ask for an exception form in this state, and your vote must be counted. This is an issue that we are seeing here, and we are seeing it in other southern states. I also want to note that we've been getting complaints and concerns from Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina of issues with mail-in ballots, absentee ballots not getting to individuals who have requested them. Because it is election day and we want to be crystal clear, if we want to make clear to the nation that if you have not received your absentee ballot today, we recommend that voters who are able to go vote in person at your county board of elections, at your polling precinct today. If you requested a mail-in ballot but it has not arrived, go in person now. If you need a ride to the polls, you can call the nonpartisan hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, and we can connect you with ride services today. As a reminder, voters who are facing issues across this country, you are not alone. We have the numbers of voting rights attorneys who are coming out in this time to support is historic. We are going to see this election through, not just today, but through to certification at the state level and at the federal level. We will be with you tomorrow and for every day until we have a certified election. I want to end on a positive note, because it can feel like the weight is so heavy right now. What we are seeing on the ground in the South is turnout that is unbelievable. The long lines are they should not be here. We can improve upon the election infrastructure. We can ensure that our communities are not under-resourced moving forward. But those long lines are telling a story about our people's desire to have their voices heard in this cycle. So again, we have said it already. I will say it again. Stay in those lines today. Help your neighbors stay in the lines. We are going to be with you to ensure that your vote counts. And we understand that the people here, the Poor People's Campaign volunteers and the thousands of volunteers across this country who are going out as nonpartisan election protection leaders in this time, are stepping into a gap where the Voting Rights Act is not there. You are being the people's preclearance in this time, and we salute you and honor you for what you are doing today and until this election is certified. I will close there, and we're happy to take additional questions about the types of issues that we are seeing that we think may continue to come up for the rest of this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Attorney Swain. Bishop Barber, we have you connected. Are you able to hear, Bishop?
I can. Attorney Swain, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Hey, great. I'm just sorry to call. We had some problems with the call. I want to say to the media, I got cut off, is that this is the boldest effort we've ever seen. We're leading with a poor and as I said earlier, I want to thank Reverend Casimir and Sister Saguta for leading the effort with Repairs and Briefs, working on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign. As we monitor this effort to reach 15 million poor and low-wage infrequent voters across the country. As you heard our co-chair, Reverend Liz, talk about earlier, this effort brought together churches and unions and Black Greek letter organizations. It brought us together in every community, every race, every creed, because you know, in this country, 60% of poor and low-wage brothers and sisters who make $50,000 or less, a family of four, 6% of Black people are poor and low wealth, which is 26 million people. 30% of whites are poor and low wealth, which is 66 million people. We don't care what color, race, or geography, we're reaching out. We reached out to everybody in a massive way that's never been tried before at touch. Just in a week and a half ago, we had gotten up to over 12 million persons. They all got video, they all got a report card on where both parties stood and both candidates stood, that are nonpartisan report cards, and a way in which to go and check their registration status and the rules around voting in their state. We reached over 900,000 poor and low-wage voters in North Carolina alone. We noted the last election, the margin of victory in the presidential race was 74,000 votes, with over 1 million poor and low-wage voters not voting. We noted there's not a state in the battleground states where poor and low-wage folk are under 40% of the voting population, and where if just 10% of poor and low-wage voters who have not voted would vote, that they could fundamentally shift the outcome of the elections. We know that poor and low-wage voters are the largest potential swing vote in the country, according to powerful and sound and serious research. Research from groups like the Lake Researchers at Cylinder Lake and others, our own researchers from Columbia University, who have shown us that it is the biggest sleeping giant in the country. And we know that these voters also traditionally face different challenges. As I heard Attorney Swain talking just then, we had incidences during early voting where polling places close to universities, like in Livingstone College and Salisbury, only had one computer and one worker. And when 5 buses of students came down to vote, they complained about them voting rather than being ready for them. And students had to wait some 4 hours, which was ridiculous and unnecessary. I'm in the field today. I've already met one person who was turned around, told they could not vote today because they didn't have a certain part of an ID, was not told that they could vote or they could go home and come back, or they could vote provisional. And we've had that issue out here. Thank God we have people to help people understand what the law is and to ensure them that we will fight for every vote. This is why we've engaged this Waking the Sleeping Giant effort ever since June 29th, when we had tens of thousands of people to show up for the mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly March on Washington, and more than 3 million people online. And so to the members of the media, this is really a push and a fight for every vote to count, every voter to vote. This is what we must have in this country. And we know, lastly, that if poor and low wage voters, 57 million voted in the last election, 30 million didn't. That's why we committed to reach those 15 million of those infrequent voters. And we also know that if poor and low wage voters just voted at the same rate as higher income voters, they could fundamentally affect every election outcome from the school board to the White House. This is a serious time and serious effort for our democracy. And we have engaged and will continue to engage it. And as Councilor Swain said, we will stay with this until all of the votes are tallied. What we're not going to do is ever just take one step back. We know finally in the South, 1/3 of all voters are poor, and 1/3 of all people are poor and low wage, and 1/3 of all white people are poor and low wage. We know that in the South, the greatest power was when the poor and low wealth, Black, white, indigenous people joined together, Latinos joined together, and are able to form a voting bloc that can fundamentally shift what Dr. King called the economic architecture of the nation. That is what is at stake, and that is why we have to ensure that all of these voters get their right place at the voting booth. We will not allow or stand for taxation without representation. We want to see every vote counted. And we have said to poor and low wage voters, some of them who said the number one reason they don't vote is no one talks to them, that you have to make people hear you. And one of the ways you do that is by raising your voice and your vote. And so we think that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Forward Justice, when we talked to them earlier, and we all decided to come together and form this voter protection program across the country. It is what is needed in this time, and we have committed to it with everything that we have. Thank you so much for allowing me to just say a word or two, but I want the media to talk primarily to our attorneys who are on the line today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. We'd now like to open it up for questions from the media. If you can please utilize the Q&A function in Zoom. I do not see any listed. Yolanda, do you see anything on your end?
No, there are no questions. Is anybody, somebody, we have somebody to raise their hand.
Great, can they please utilize the Q&A function on the chat?
They want to act. I think they want to ask their question vocally.
Do we have a name?
Yes, Chauncey Alcorn.
Yes, thank you so much, Chauncey Alcorn. I see your question. Thank you. It says, any additional details on the issues happening in Georgia?
Yeah,
And then
I'll
the
just
next.
say that they're still developing. So I don't want to share anything without being absolutely certain. What we do know is that there are two precincts, precinct 52 and precinct 112. Let me just make sure I'm saying that right. Again, this is immediate. Yes, precincts 52 and 112 in Gwinnett County, Georgia, that have been extended by 58 minutes. The polls were set to close at 7. They're now closing at 7:58. And what's really important is that you have until 7:58 to get in line to vote. And once you are in line, no matter how long it takes to vote, you have the right to vote. You should not leave the line, but if you stay in line, if it takes hours upon hours, you have a right to cast your ballot. And so it's important to get that message out for folks who may have tried to cast their ballot earlier today and were unable to because of the bomb threats that proved to be completely false and generated by Russia, not even efforts from local threats. So this is something that we should spread the word about, and if the media could do that work to help us amplify this poll site extension, that would be very helpful, and to emphasize that once you are in line, you always have a right to cast your ballot.
Thank you so very much. Mike Ludwig with A Truth Out. Do you have any details on incidents, reports about aggressive electioneering outside polls and intimidation? We keep hearing vague reports.
I'm happy to say again, we do have reports there as well. Nothing that has risen to the level of obstructing the election. So we have poll monitors in 7 states on the ground today. Some of them have had to explain their nonpartisan role and explain that they have a right to be there. We secured a letter from, not a letter, but we wrote a letter to the South Carolina State Election Commission over the weekend when our poll monitors experienced some problems at the polling sites. And they agreed to instruct all 46 county officials that we have the right to be there. And we have asked other states to do that as well, so that people are aware that these folks are there to help, as I emphasized. And those are some of the ways in which we've been managing issues with some election officials on the ground. And at this point, as far as I know, personally, there hasn't been anything that has obstructed an election.
I'll just note on this, we have seen a significant number of aggressive electioneering problems across the state of North Carolina during the early voting period. On Friday, we sent a cease and desist letter to a third-party group, Insight, in the state that was threatening to engage in aggressive poll monitoring program on election day, as well as threatening to challenge individual voters based on Hispanic surnames in the state. We're happy to provide that cease and desist letter. What we are seeing today is isolated incidents of aggressive electioneering at polling sites across the state, and we've successfully been able to get ejected individuals who are engaging in that behavior. One thing that I will note is that throughout this today, voting rights advocates across the South are paying particular attention to places where we've seen repeated issues in specific counties. But this evening, we want to keep our eyes out for where there may be increased engagement by aggressive electioneering groups like we saw in 2020, where we saw trucks and individuals in trucks and waving flags, driving around polling places and keeping people from getting into the polling site. If anyone is hearing those reports, if any voters are experiencing this, we want to hear about it immediately and want to be able to take action, because that is the kind of behavior that can obstruct access to the ballot, and there is no room for that under federal or state law. You have a right to be able to access your polling place free from intimidation.
Thank you so much. I believe that concludes our questions for this briefing. Thank you all for joining us here for our National Election Day briefing. Please stay tuned by looking at our various social media platforms for updates. As you heard it here today, vote, use the voter protection resources that were lifted up here in this briefing, and stay tuned for more information. Thank you all, everyone.
The live stream is clear.